Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Nightlight. That was the magical voice of Ken Quiet Hawk, and you can find his magical voice at nativestorytellers.com. Mark, Eddy, and I are back again tonight with another exciting exploration of hidden history for your enlightenment and enjoyment. Our first hour guest will be KATHERINE CHILJAN, author of Shakespeare Suppressed, which is a really cool book, and RAMON JIMENEZ, author of the just-released Shakespeare Apprenticeship. We will be discussing that we should be giving credit for the world's greatest canon to another author. They'll also be featured presenters at the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference in Oakland, California in October. Lon Krieger will be joining us in the second hour to discuss ancient garden beds of Michigan, which will be his subject at the coming up AAPS conference next month. He's also a contributing author to Ancient American magazine. So, Mark, here we are again with some really fascinating people to talk to tonight.
I think they are fascinating, and there's some fascinating research that needs to be heard by lots of people.
Absolutely.
And
the subject the subject that they're talking on is one that is not taught in school. So it's really important for people to realize that as research is done and people look into things, what used to be history and common accepted history no longer applies.
Right. And I think we're going to get some new insights and also see that we really need to reevaluate what we've been taught in history and literature classes, and I think all three guests tonight will set the record straight.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So who do you want to welcome on first?
Okay, well, hey, first of all, I just wanted to say that the Mothman Festival was very well attended, lots of fun, informative lecturers. It was a family outing, and the kids trying out the zip lines for the first time, and the fashion statements coming out of it will rival anything from the catwalks in Paris and Milan. So I just wanted to let everyone know, we promoted it, and I don't know how many people listened to that show actually ended up going to Point Pleasant, but it was a great time. And,
that's fabulous. And they didn't get rained out.
Correct. And fortunately, we only had a little bit of rain from the Hurricane Florence, but just direct your thoughts and prayers to those who were affected far more severely.
Absolutely.
But But with the Shakespeare authorship controversy, we might as well just get started on that. And we
well,
really
let me
appreciate.
They're both of their mics are open.
Okay, good. And I just wanted let Ramon know how much we appreciate giving us basically an exclusive about his new book, and we'll be covering that in just a few minutes. But maybe just start off with Katherine and her book, Shakespeare Suppressed. And Katherine, you reproduce in your book the introduction to the first folio, and you have quite a lengthy section that gives us the maybe some of the first indications that something is we're dealing with a mistaken identity. Something's not quite right with the information presented in the first folio. Maybe we should start with why was it printed so long after such a successful run of so many plays?
Yeah, the first folio is a great place to start because this is that book. It's a book of 36 Shakespeare plays, the first collection of Shakespeare plays, and it was printed in 1623. And it's the origin of the hoax that was perpetrated against the general public and also the great author, pointing the authorship of one of the greatest writers of the period, if not of all time, and he was recognized as such, throwing the authorship on a man with humble origins from a small town who had, as far as we know, no education. And that is, we call him the Stratford man. His name was William Shakespeare. It looks like the great artist, the great author's name, but actually it was pronounced Shakespeare. If you look at the documentary records of the times, they would spell things phonetically, and it was usually Shakespear, Shaksper, something like that, where it's a short A, Shakespeare. It was rarely written as Shakespeare as we know it. So anyway, going back to this book, there were 16 pages of the preface where we have poems written to the great author. And they acknowledge that he has died. This is 1623, and it's true that the Stratford man was dead at that point, about 7 years. And one poem written by one person, actually Ben Jonson, another playwright, prominent one of the period, he refers to Sweet Swan of Avon. So we have the place name Avon. That's in one poem. And then you turn a few pages later on another poem by another man. There's a reference to Shakespeare's Stratford Monument. So you have on one page Avon and another page Stratford. If you put them together, Stratford-on-Avon, and that's where the Stratford man thousands of tourists go every year to that little village, thinking it's the birthplace of the great author. But that is the origin. That's where the idea that the great author came from Stratford-on-Avon. But prior to that, no one of the period connected Stratford-on-Avon with the great William Shakespeare, the author of Hamlet. And so that's the first folio. And interestingly, the five prefatory pages are completely blank. And, why is that the case? And at the same time, they didn't give us any biographical information about the great author. All they said basically was Avon Stratford and that he was dead. That's in essence what they tell us. And even from the very first page, it has that famous image, black and white image that everyone knows. If they think of Shakespeare, they usually think of this image with the man with the very high forehead and kind of strange-looking hair. But right off the bat, there's something odd because this picture is not someone with bay leaves in his hair or holding a pen or holding a book. That's what typically a playwright or an author, a writer, how they would be depicted in books. And there's many, many examples like that. But in this case, there's nothing. It just shows a man that looks like a gentleman, fairly plain. So there's that's kind of raises a red flag. But even more so, opposite this page is a poem by Ben Jonson. He says, "Reader, look not on his picture, but his book." So there's another red flag. Don't even look at this picture. So those are just the first few oddities. There's a lot more, And I get it. I have a whole chapter devoted to it.
Yeah, and you do go into a lot of detail, and you even say that the folios are dedicated to the Earl of Pembroke and Montgomery, and that kind of gives it the official stamp of nobility approval, or it makes it look more official.
Yes, that was the dedication letter. Yes.
Yeah.
And it was, interestingly, this dedication letter to these two brother earls, it was signed by actors, the name of John Hemmings and Henry Condell. And the odd thing, again, here's another odd thing that raises a red flag. For over 200 years, Shakespeare scholars have said that this was written by Ben Jonson. It was not written by the actors, Hemmings and Condell. So there's another, fraud, if you will. Beyond the other fraud, even in the title of the first folio. Today we call it the first folio. Folio because it's a large book size, and first because it was the first edition. It went into 4 editions. It was very, very popular, very successful. But the actual title, if you look on the title page of this book, is Master William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, published according to the true original copies. Well, that last line is not true. It's another false idea, because the condition of many of the plays contained in the book were in pretty bad shape. So they were obviously not the author's originals.
Okay. And, Catherine, since you just mentioned that Shakespeare was dead by 1616, if we go by what the Stratfordians say, Ramon's brand new book, Shakespeare's Apprenticeship, is covering the earlier stages of the author's life, and so we need to go back a little bit in time and get Ramon's information on what his discovery is all about. So, Ramon, you are delving into the need for us to reconsider some of these early Shakespeare or early Elizabethan plays were written by this great dramatist, and 30 years later he rewrote them to the point of them being recognized as world masterpieces. So, what's the background story on these plays? Or were they just recently discovered, or did you make the connection that these weren't by some other Elizabethan dramatists? They were by the author who would later become world renowned for Hamlet and King Lear.
Well, that's right. These plays were published or performed during Queen Elizabeth's reign. They were published anonymously. Many of Shakespeare's plays, the genuine ones, were also published anonymously. But these were, as I argue in my book, the first versions of 7 different canonical plays that we regard now as Shakespeare's genuine plays. I noticed first an old play called The Famous Victories of Henry V. It was first printed in 1598, but it was obviously written much earlier than that. This is a short, crude play of 1,500 lines, all in prose, and it is about, it covers the same period, and it has the same characters and the same action as the Prince Hal plays that we know as Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, and Henry V. What the playwright did with this play was expand it and enhance it and add to it and create these 3 canonical plays out of it. There are 4 other plays. The True Tragedy of Richard III was first printed in 1597, and Shakespeare rewrote that perhaps 10 years later and created the Richard III that's in the canon today. A third one is The Troublesome Reign of John, King of England. He rewrote that as King John, which was not even printed until the first folio. The Taming of a Shrew is the 4th play. This is his first version of the Taming of the Shrew that we see today on stages. And the 5th one is The True Chronicle History of King Lear. This was a romance about King Lear dividing his kingdom among his, or between his 2 daughters, and Cordella, or Cordelia as we know her now, was refused a portion. That play was rewritten into the great tragedy that we know today as King Lear. All of these were anonymous plays, these 5 plays, and they are still anonymous. Orthodox scholars refuse to assign them to Shakespeare on the grounds that they are not up to his standard, and that is true. They are not very well written. They are well constructed, but they are obviously below the standard we expect from Shakespeare. But the other thing is they haven't been able to identify the author of these anonymous plays. There's been only one serious attempt to identify the author of just one of these plays, and that in chapter 3 of my book, I refute that attempt. So this, in effect, is the addition of 5 previously anonymous plays to the Shakespeare canon, and that's what my book is about.
Okay, Ramon, did you see? You were just talking about it's well constructed. The plays are well, the masterpieces are really well constructed. But did you see like a repetition of some words or phrases in the early versions and the masterpieces? So like did you have to do any kind of profiling?
Yes, and there certainly are repetitions of phrases and words in the subsequent canonical plays. But what is more important is that the plots are the same. The plots are almost identical between the early play and the canonical play. The characters, almost all the characters are in both plays, the same characters. Some of them have the same name. For instance, Kate in The Taming of the Shrew is Kate in The Taming of Shrew, the earlier play. King Lear and his daughters are in the early King Lear. Richard III and all the people around him, some of them that he murdered, they reappear in Richard III. The same with the other two plays. Also, there are numerous dramatic devices and plot elements that are repeated in the canonical plays. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that they are also by Shakespeare, because if they were not, then he took these plots, he took these characters and these dramatic devices, these images, these ideas, and put them into his own play. So it's pretty clear, if you read the early play and the canonical play, that they're by the same person.
Okay,
Lon, Ramon, I have a question. Was it common practice because I know a lot of times there really weren't scripts for a lot of these plays, or they were written on the fly, just so to speak. Was it common for a play to take form in one place and evolve over a different number of troops or groups of people until someone finally took it and put it more formally down on paper?
Well, not generally, no. These 5 plays are unique in Elizabethan drama. We don't have 2 versions of other plays, by other authors. Maybe 1 or 2 examples, but these 5 are unique.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and Ramon, when you're talking about, these are early plays by the great author, how old is the author about this time?
Well, that's the key question, and from the evidence that I have to say that these are plays by a teenage writer, and we haven't mentioned the Earl of Oxford yet, but of course he is the person who is the actual author of the Shakespeare canon, and there is evidence connecting him to these 5 early plays during his teen age, that is, between the time he was 13 and 20. And the various things happened to him during that period. He was first accused of being illegitimate. Then a couple of years later, he entered the law college, the Gray's Inn. And these events show up in the plays. They're in Troublesome Reign of John. There is a character, a fictional character, added or inserted into the historical record who suffers the same accusation as the Earl of Oxford did. 4 of these plays have very few legal terms or legal issues in them. The 5th one, King Lear, is full of legal terms and legal issues, over 60, just in this in the first version of King Lear. So that's another indication that 4 of them were written before he entered law school and became familiar with the language of the law, and 1 he wrote a year or 2 later after he'd been exposed to the law. And we know that throughout the Shakespeare canon, the plays are filled with legal terms and legal issues because the author had legal training.
Okay, well, how much legal training did Shakespeare have at the Stratford Grammar School?
Well, we don't have any record that Shakespeare had any education at all. It appears that the records for the Stratford Grammar School at the time he was young no longer exist. So we cannot say that he either went to that school or he didn't go to that school. There's no record that he entered any university or any law school, no record that he traveled anywhere except to London. So the record is pretty bare with respect to his education. And there are some other facts about his competence, but we can wait and talk about that when they come up.
Okay. But your comments these early versions of the masterpieces were written by teenage author. That makes us have to call into question the need to redate the plays, and you can look and Catherine consulted you, and Mark Anderson did as well in his Shakespeare by Another Name, and you do bring up some really interesting points, like the example on page 48 to 49 of Catherine's book about General Butler being sent to Ireland. That's another example of needing to redate the plays, and we just don't have an accurate chronology of this time, when everything was written at this time.
That's right.
Can you explain a little bit about the difference in this, the traditional view interpretation of the this Irish passage, and what you are saying about General Butler's expedition to Ireland?
Yes, well, the first thing to understand is that no Shakespeare play has been confidently dated to any particular date. We have performance dates, we have publication dates, we have other dates when people mention the play, but the scholars haven't been able to nail down a precise date for any Shakespeare play. These plays, the evidence that I have is that these plays were written by the teenage Earl of Oxford between 1563 and 1570. And some of the plays are pretty closely dated, others are not. It's not so clear, but they all fall within this period. They are very similar to each other, and as I mentioned, 4 of them were clearly written before he went to law school. So in that period, these 5 plays were written, and they were probably performed at the court. Shakespeare of Stratford wasn't born until 1564. So if the dates for these plays and the evidence for them being Shakespeare plays, holds up, that eliminates Shakespeare of Stratford from the picture.
Okay. And
now, you also asked about General Butler. Well, that's in one of the plays, Henry V. The Orthodox scholars have determined that a certain passage in the chorus to the fifth act, that passage was written about the Earl of Essex, whom Queen Elizabeth sent to Ireland in March of 1599 to put down a rebellion. And so they have dated that play to 1599, and they call that, the strongest evidence for the date of any Shakespeare play. Well, I've been able to show that it couldn't have been a reference to Essex at that time. Number one, he failed of his mission completely, and within a couple of months, it was known in London that he had failed, and he scurried back to London and was admonished by the Queen, and within a year or two was beheaded. Now, I've been able to associate that passage in the chorus to another general, Sir Thomas Butler, who was a confidant of Elizabeth and whom she sent to Ireland to put down a rebellion in the same way, but in 1583, not 1599. And there's a lot of ancillary evidence that supports this date as the date that Henry V premiered at court, and that is the winter of 1583-84. And, of course, at that time, Shakespeare was, 19? And there's similar evidence for the other plays.
Okay. Well, we need to bring Catherine in.
Yeah, I would love to give another example. Like another play at court was in 1577 was a play called The History of Error, and that corresponds to the Comedy of Errors. Now, the Orthodox professor will tell you that was written in 1592, but here it was, probably an earlier version of the play being performed before Queen Elizabeth in 1577, 15 years earlier. There's a lot of evidence like this. In fact, in the appendix of my book, Shakespeare Suppressed, I give 93, quote-unquote, too early allusions to the Shakespeare plays. And there's quite a few to Hamlet, as early as 1589. And yet the Orthodox scholars will tell you it was written in 1601. And yet, like, for example, there's a reference to the line to be or not to be in 1593. There's a play performance of Hamlet in 1594, but the Orthodox scholars will say, oh, no, it can't be, because it was too, mature a play. They only think the Stratford man started writing circa 1590, 1592. They don't even have a record of him in London until 1592, and that was not as a playwright. That was as a moneylender. The first reference we have to him and the theater was when he was 30 years old.
So with both of your examples, if we're going by Edward de Vere as being the author, there's almost like a 20-year difference in the play, the dating of the plays. And that's like pretty standard.
In some cases, it's even more than that.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, that's it goes from taking someone from being just getting started, post college, early 20s, to a more mature person. That makes 25 years makes a big difference in the maturity of a writer.
Absolutely.
Right.
Okay, and we just heard a little bit about Ramon corrected the traditional interpretation of this passage about Ireland from Henry V. Catherine, in your Shakespeare Suppressed, you also emphasize the sonnets are more autobiographical. You do have focus on the age. You do break the sonnets down into some of them do have passages lamenting getting old, death approaching. The traditional Shakespeare person would say, well, he was only 30, and people didn't live that long then. That just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's another problem. We don't know exactly when the sonnets were written. All we know is that two were published in 1598, 99 in the Passionate Pilgrim, but the rest were in 1609. The Stratford man still had about he died in 1616, so we have another 9 years to go. So it's not likely that he would say, like in Sonnet 32, when that churl death my bones with dust shall cover, or my glass shall not persuade me that I'm old. Like, little hints here and there that he is an older man. When the Stratford man was, pretty much in his prime still. But the sonnets are mostly written in the first person, and they tell us his deep feelings for a young man, a beautiful young man, and a dark lady, in which those three were involved in a love triangle. In fact, I'm going to be on a panel at the Oakland conference to discuss the dark lady's identity. But the most important thing is that the author reveals who he is in these sonnets. Like, for example, in Sonnet 62, he says, methinks no face so gracious is as mine. Well, gracious was a term meant for nobility or even royalty. So he's saying that his face, he has a gracious face. He's talking about his noble face. Another great giveaway is Sonnet 125, were it aught to me I bore the canopy, with my extern the outward honoring. And this is a reference to bearing a canopy over Queen Elizabeth. When she was in public, 4 or 5 people would hold like tent poles with a covering over her as she's going through the street. Well, to be one of those 4 people or so to hold the canopy was a great honor. You had to be somebody, fairly highly ranked, or if you were like, an important person at a university or some sort of organization, then you would have that opportunity. But here, the great author says, "Were it aught to me," meaning, is it anything to me that I held the canopy? That's somebody who's saying it didn't mean much to me. I did it, but what's the big deal? Whereas if the Stratford man who came from humble origins, he had no court connections. To be the man to hold the canopy, that would have been one of the greatest honors of his life. And we do know that the Stratford man was trying to advance himself socially. He and his father applied for a coat of arms, so they could put the word gentleman at the end after their name. That was a big deal. So these little bits and pieces in the sonnets don't match the profile of the Stratford man.
Another example, Mark, is Sonnet 72, where he says, "My name be buried where my body is." Mm-hmm. In other words, he's concealing himself. And in a later sonnet, 76, he says, there is a line that says, "Every word doth almost tell my name." And there he's referring to Vere. That was his name, Edward de Vere. And there are examples like that throughout the sonnets and throughout the plays that identify the writer as a nobleman and a particular nobleman.
Yes, in fact, Hamlet. Hamlet is a profile of the Earl of Oxford. Like, for example, Hamlet, he was on a ship that was attacked by pirates, and he barely escaped with his life. Well, that exact incident happened to the Earl of Oxford. The same thing. He went and took a grand tour of Europe, and on his way back, he barely made it because of the pirates. And he also, many historians see a connection between Polonius, who was the counselor to the king, and Lord Burleigh, who was the counselor to Queen Elizabeth, the main counselor to Queen Elizabeth. And in fact, Shakespeare lampoons Lord Burleigh. This guy is one of the most powerful men in England. How could he do that? Number one, how would he even know about him to lampoon him? Number two, how did he survive doing such a thing?
Okay, well, and making the Queen unhappy did cause people to be executed. So I don't see how, like, a country bumpkin guy could make fun of someone so important to the Queen and get away with it, unless he had connections, which takes us back to your and Ramon's comments that the real author was a nobleman who actually could stand his ground against the nobility.
Yes.
Okay, and the opening of the sonnets is addressed to someone who displeased the Queen, and he survived. You want to get into that a little bit? The Earl of Southampton.
Right. The great author dedicated his first two poems. They're long poems, narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, and then The Rape of Lucrece. Both were dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. He was, at that time, when it came out in 1593 and 1594, the Earl of Southampton, he was a glittering aristocrat. He was, the Queen's, one of her top favorites. Young, handsome, beautiful. Everybody was, wanted to date him or know him. How did the Stratford man get access to him? How did he meet him? We have no clue. And back then, like you mentioned, if you dedicated a work to a nobleman and he didn't like it or he didn't know you or whatever, the next edition, if it did come out again, they would remove that dedication. And yet Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, they went through multiple editions, with these dedications intact. So obviously they had a connection, but as far as we know, there's none to the Stratford men, no documentary evidence. But the Earl of Oxford did know the Earl of Southampton, because at one point his daughter, the Earl of Oxford's daughter, Elizabeth, was proposed a matching with the Earl of Southampton. It didn't happen, but certainly they knew of each other right off the bat there.
And on top of that, there's no evidence that Shakespeare of Stratford ever sought a patron or obtained one or had any contact with a nobleman or a patron. So there's evidence for Oxford. There's no evidence for Shakespeare on point after point with these plays and poems.
Okay, so Ramon, when people come to the conference from October 11th to the 14th in Oakland, if they want more information, they go to Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship.org. But this kind of information is going to be discussed. Catherine said she'll be covering the Dark Lady information as well. But what are some other topics that will be brought up at the conference?
Well, there are 4 days of program, mostly lectures by scholars. They range from discussions of the use of legal language in the plays, the dating of the plays, the other connections between Oxford and the plays. There will be a film shown on Saturday night about Oxford's life. And at other points during the conference, there'll be videos, short videos about the authorship question. And I think we'll even have some short dramatic presentation as well.
Okay. And Catherine, we have like 12 minutes or so left. What's the difference between viewing the authorship controversy from a trained historian's point of view versus someone like me who just had to take some classes in Shakespeare as a literature major? Is there a pretty big difference? Or?
Well, I think it's very important, and I don't think you need to be a trained scholar, but it's the part about evidence. There is lifetime evidence during one's lifetime, and then there's posthumous evidence after one dies. Those are really the two categories, and that's how I did it, set it up in my book, Shakespeare Suppressed. For the evidence for the Stratford man as the great author is entirely posthumous, and it was like, as we opened today's show, it was the book, the first folio of the plays that threw us off the scent. But as far as lifetime evidence, okay, people can say, well, wait a minute, how is it that we still think that he is the author? And it's true. He was involved with the theater, the Stratford man. He did come to London, and he was first allowed to receive payment for an acting company. So he was associated with this one acting company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. And then, a few years later, he became a founding shareholder of the Globe Theater. And then a few years later, another theater, the Blackfriars Theater. And when Queen Elizabeth died, a new acting company was formed called the King's Men in 1603. And he was a member of that acting company. So, yes, he was involved in the theater as a member of an acting company and as a theater shareholder. But that's about it. There's nothing there's no proof that he actually acted. And there's no payments to him as a writer or even as an actor. So when we do have payments to other actors and writers of the period, we have, for example, a book, a diary of a theater producer, Philip Henslow. And in this book, it's a valuable resource. There's many playwrights written in there as far as being paid for plays and also being loaned money. But nowhere is in that diary is a mention of Shakespeare. So, everywhere you're going to look for Shakespeare in the documentary evidence, with something, concrete that he really was a writer, you can't find it.
And the same way with Shakespeare's will, Mark. We have the will of Shakespeare of Stratford, or a 3-page will. There's no mention of his theater activities. There's no mention of his theater property. There's no mention of any play that he either wrote or appeared in.
And they were, at the time, there were 20 plays that had never been in print.
He doesn't mention plays or books or manuscripts in his will. There are no. He left no notebooks or no diaries. No evidence that he wrote anything. In fact, from the 6 signatures that we have, it appears that he was not comfortable writing. Certainly not writing his name, since these signatures are not completed, and several of them are spelled differently. So there's simply a total vacuum when it comes to any evidence that Shakespeare had anything to do with playwriting or writing of any kind.
Yeah, it's an unproven theory, really.
And it's a historical question, not a literary one. That's where I think a lot of Shakespeare scholars have gone astray. Is they look at the plays and they try to figure out who wrote them by the words and the language and the ideas and so on, but they don't look at the historical record. And there simply is no historical record that Shakespeare wrote anything.
That's right.
Okay.
And what it boils down to is that William Shakespeare was a pen name. In fact, half the time that the name was in print, referring to the great author, it had a hyphen between shake and spear, which was an indication of a maiden name, spear shaking. And, you can apply that instantly to the Earl of Oxford. He was a jouster. He was a champion he won 2 or 3 tournaments of jousting. And the main instrument that they use is called a spear. So he was a spear shaker. That was also a popular phrase, to shake one's spear during that time frame. So, academia can't seem to understand that there could have been 2 William Shakespeares of the period who were involved in the theater. One pretty much as an investor and a financier, and the other one the great author using a pen name. And this was not unusual. For example, I often say John Davies. There were 2 poets named John Davies of this period. And to this day, scholars still mistake, which wrote what.
Oh, in your analysis of the first folio, you do mention Lily, Marlowe, Kidd, and they were actually more contemporary with the Earl of Oxford. Is that right?
No.
Yeah. Yes. In fact, Lily was one of Oxford's secretaries.
Those others, though, Marlowe and Johnson and so on, they're more contemporary with Shakespeare's dates.
Okay. Well, it's just they're mentioned in the Folio, and I was just wanted to try to tie in with what Catherine said about John Davies, and just put together. Over the last hour, we've done a real nice job of piecing together what a lot of was going on at court and the theaters, and
Mark.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Mark, I have a question. Shakespeare had children, and I believe they were literate. Is there any history of what became of the children? If they were connected to the theater, if they were connected in any way to any kind of productions or anything like that? Because theoretically there should have been money or something.
Yeah,
Catherine?
well, William Shakespeare, he did have 2 daughters, but as far as we know, they were illiterate. And the Strapper man's father was also illiterate. He was raised in an illiterate household. So that's not the environment to foster one of the greatest geniuses of all time.
Well, whoever it was has hid quite well, actually. Then you do begin to wonder. I know that there are reasons because of court stuff and everything that and some of the plays certainly weren't kind towards the court. So, but there's such the expanse of what it was. I mean, you have things like Hamlet and King Lear and all of the Richards, and then you have Much Ado About Nothing, and he hits the
Dream. Yeah.
I mean, he hits the full spectrum of of expression, and I mean, Midsummer's Night's Dream is just really out there. It's almost, if there was pot then, I would have thought he would have been smoking it. So, and
Barbara,
yes.
I just go ahead and finish your thought. I want to add something about the conference after you finish.
Oh, sure. No, most authors have a genre, and he didn't seem to have one. I mean, there were groupings all over the place of different things, but they were so. The spectrum was so broad. It I could easily see how people would think different people had written the different groupings.
Right. I just wanted to mention and invite everyone to come to our Oakland conference. It'll be at the Oakland Marriott, the 11th through the 15th. Students are admitted without charge, and also faculty. And as I mentioned, there'll be a variety of speakers, videos, there'll be a film, and everyone is welcome. We're inviting everyone to come, the Oakland Marriott in October.
Fantastic.
And we're down to a minute or so. Ramon, where can people find your book? And Catherine, you want to plug your website as well?
Well, my book's available through the regular book-selling channels, Amazon. It's published by McFarland, and they have a website. It can be purchased there also. And there will be copies at the conference for a reduced rate. And Catherine's book as well. Yes.
And you can get my book. You can visit ShakespeareSuppressed.com. I'm also on Amazon. And if you want to be really good, go to your local library and tell them about Ramon's book and my book, and have them order it too. This type of resources belong in every library.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for being here tonight. We really, really appreciate this.
Thank you so
Thanks
much for the opportunity. Yes.
It was great. Thank you. A lot of fun. Hope it was more enjoyable than Coast.
Well, and
Right.
hopefully we can get you guys back on again at another time too.
That would be
Fine.
lovely.
We'd be glad to.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
thanks so much
and,
for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Good night now.
And we won't talk about bacon.
Bye.
Good night, guys.
Good night.
Okay, Barbara.
Okay,
I think
Mark.
we're waiting for Lon to call in.
We're waiting for him to call in, yeah. And, you know, we're going to be talking about a topic of mine that is favorite, you know, ancient. Anything in America, you know, perks my interest and gets me excited. And certainly, you know, and I was about to really start going on and on here, and here he is. Hold on a second. Welcome to the show, Lon.
Well, hello, Barbara and Mark. Good to chat
Lon.
with you tonight. Hi. How are you?
Well, you hit us
I'm
right
fine.
on the nose.
Oh, good. Yeah, I was just enjoying the show. What a great, fascinating couple of folks, and very fascinating topic. I'm going to run right out and buy the books now. I want to learn more.
Well, if you could get Katherine's book at a discount any place, do it. It's not a cheap book, but it is very worthwhile reading.
Well,
I don't know about Ramon's.
Any really good book?
Yeah, that's just out.
Yeah, any good book deserves a good price.
It's got it. I'm really excited tonight to have you on the show because you're going to be talking about something that I didn't know existed, and that's the garden beds in Michigan.
Thank you. Yes, it's a fascinating subject. I think once people see some of the original surveys and then hear a little bit about them and then are brought into the present, history comes alive on this particular topic, I think. And I was talking to a 15-year-old yesterday from Punta Arenas, Chile, and he started asking me questions about this ancient American history, and he was just dumbfounded. He was amazed. So hopefully we can really open some eyes with some fascinating historical explanation here.
Have you been able to carbon date any of them? I mean, to get a real feel for how old they are?
To a large extent, yes. If we're talking about, in particular, the recently rediscovered ancient garden beds of middle and upper eastern Wisconsin, which they have literally just scratched the surface of in the past 4 or 5 years, they have found charcoal and plant phytoliths, plant starches from the mound or from the raised garden beds in upper Wisconsin that date. The early datings we have presently are circa 800 to 1000 AD. So these would be considered, in my view, some of the more recent ones. So as we discuss and you probe the topic, we can take people even further back in time.
Okay, and Lon, what in your articles in Ancient American Magazine, you have the reproductions of some of the original drawings of what the garden beds look like. You have the spoke wheel beds. You have some that look like the outline of a ship. Others that are just
strange geometry, right?
Yeah, like horizontal rows. Do we know? Was certain crop grown in the certain geometric pattern? What was the purpose for these designs?
Well, that was the first great question and mystery that grabbed my attention when I first discovered these diagrammatic surveys that had been developed by an early Northwest territorial explorer by the name of Henry Schoolcraft, which I know you are familiar with, but our audience may never heard of him. But he was a tremendous researcher, surveyor, and explorer from about the 1818 to about 1860 or so. And in his early explorations into southwest Michigan, primarily the Kalamazoo, St. Joseph, Three Rivers, Paw Paw area, down to about the current border of Michigan and Indiana. In that southwest region were tremendous post-glacial river systems. The Grand River, which was an impressive river, still runs from Grand Rapids southward and over to Lake Michigan. This area that he happened across had hundreds of these large and small spoked wheels, ship forms, like you say. There was essentially 8 different types of geometric raised garden beds that he came across in this vast expanse of tremendous farmlands, ancient farmlands, which are still among the best crop producing areas in Michigan today. And latest information I had a few years ago was that Michigan is actually the 4th or 5th largest agricultural state and producing state, and this southwest region of Michigan anciently held these tremendous geometrically designed beds. Now, to give you scale, and then I'll answer your question more directly. I noticed that Barbara is streaming some of the diagrams and schematics of these. They are, of course, one-dimensional. I did do a rather funky artist attempt at a rendering of a bird's eye view of what they might have looked like on the landscape. These garden beds ranged, according to Schoolcraft, anywhere from 20 acres to as large as 300 acres. So they were sometimes massive in their coverage of the landscape. They were approximate. When we use the term raised garden beds, just visualize these beds being 18 to 22, 24 inches high anciently in these fascinating geometries. Now, it remains a mystery, of course, why they formulated their beds in this type of format or design. We have no real, all we can do is speculate. And one of the speculations, for instance, for the spoked wheel might have to do with an astronomical reflection they thought of that they saw in the heavens. It might be somewhat, there have been some researchers who talk about ancient circles in regard to the ancient Atlanteans and so forth. I don't know that I subscribe to much of it, other than they found that the system of those geometries worked for them. And to your point about what were they growing and how were they growing it on these garden beds, they were using what has come down to us today through First Nation people today, a system known as the Three Sisters ancient form of gardening. And this is a system that wherein a person takes a few maize seeds or corn seeds. You plant them, for instance, if you consider that spoked wheel, they would plant the corn in the center of the hub, and it turns out that corn is a tremendous, it just sucks the nitrogen out of the soil. And so these people were wizards at gardening, and so what they did is they would then plant bean seeds around the outside of the corn in the center, and the beans would then climb the corn stalks as they grew, and they were symbiotic. So the corn stalks would raise the bean vines, and the beans would grow. They would help shelter the corn stalks from high winds, and they had the added benefit of helping to restore nitrogen into the soil. The third crop that they would then plant outside the beans was squash primarily, and the squash would also help restore and help regenerate nutrients into the soil. Now,
that sounds brilliant. Why don't we do that today?
It is fascinating, and the Seneca Nation, for instance, in Pennsylvania and southern New York region, there are a great many First Nation people who still farm in the Three Sisters system. In fact, if you were in St. Ignace, Michigan, I could direct you to the Ojibwa Cultural Museum, which has an ancient bark lodge, and they have a sign that talks about their use of the Three Sisters system, which they pronounce Giti Ayang, and that refers to the Three Sisters method, which they still employ today. And so to take you to another area of America, which I find fascinating, is still has the Three Sisters system in use, and also employs, oddly enough, raised geometric garden forms, are the Zuni of Upper New Mexico. And then in Chinampas, Mexico, they farm today massive raised garden beds in a Three Sisters form, along with wild rice. And we might touch on wild rice later on when we talk about Wisconsin. But initially, my research was focused on these ancient garden beds that were talked about and described by Schoolcraft, and I found them fascinating. And I began this research a couple years ago, and as I delved further into it, I discovered that it was considered a dead topic among archaeologists, anthropologists, and academics. My background, incidentally, goes back to the University of Arizona, where I did my undergraduate work in the late 70s, primarily in geoscience, in geology, anthropology, and archaeology. And then later I changed my degree. And then in the late 80s, I did my master's degree at the University of Oklahoma. That said, I'm also happen to be on my grandfather's side, Creek Cherokee. And so our family has, the Creek are known as the people of the one fire, for instance, whereas the Chippewa, Ojibwa, Odawa are known as the people of the three fires. And so we have all these many interactive relationships. But it turns out that as I pursued my research, because I found this geometry fascinating, and I don't know that we'll ever get an answer to it, but by the 1880s, a man named Bella Hubbard, who was the assistant state archaeologist for the state of Michigan, or geologist, I should say, for the state of Michigan, sought to try to document and relocate and find some of these ancient beds that had been described by pioneers earlier for 50 years or more. And he only managed to find a few rows on the edge of a woods near Kalamazoo. And he said basically they've all been plowed under. Now, we do have good descriptions of the beds from Schoolcraft, and thankfully he documented these things, and others did as best they could at the time. Otherwise, we'd know nothing about it. But this research remained dead in the water, essentially, until it was readdressed in 1959 by several academics, primarily out of the University of Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, I believe. And they tried to pin down which native tribes might have created these beds anciently. So they ran the gamut from the Potawatomi to the Huron, Odawa, the Mascoutins, and various other tribes, the Ho-Chunk Sauk in Wisconsin and so forth. And after a year and a half of research, deep research and study, they basically called it quits and said, guess what? None of these tribes or groups were capable or had any interest in creating these types of beds. Now that kind of put the signpost of dead end on the research, and nobody really took it up until about 1992 or 4, when a young graduate student by the name of William Gardner out of University of Wisconsin got wind from, I believe, a Wisconsin DNR fellow who told him about some raised rows in some woods near Hulbert Creek, Wisconsin, and he went out and looked at the beds and discovered that they appeared to be ancient. He did his doctorate on it, and now today he and a Dr. David Overstreet, also from the University of Wisconsin, who is an emeritus professor at the College of Menominee Nation now. Between the two of them and their graduate students and volunteers, they have pinned down probably 24 different sites from the Wisconsin Dells area there to the Menominee Reservation in upper Wisconsin. Consequently, we now know a great deal more than we ever thought about these ancient garden beds. And when it comes to, and of course, as I say earlier, we have basically no traces of them in Michigan, but now we have a tremendous remnant of garden beds in upper Wisconsin. And there was a fellow in Hulbert who owned all this acreage where these first beds were rediscovered by Gardner. And in 2009, the fellow donated 200 acres of these ancient woodlands to the Ho-Chunk Sauk Historical Society and the Ho-Chunk Sauk tribe, who in their tradition have been on the land there for a couple thousand years. Flash forward more recently to, say, 2014, 15, so Dr. Overstreet, along with William Gardner and their archaeologists, found literally hundreds of acres of ancient garden beds on the Menominee Reservation and round about it in the Wolf River and Wisconsin River areas, Wolf Creek, Wolf River, and they have, I think, 24 major sites that they are just scratching the surface on. And if your listeners are interested to actually see what they look like, there's a really neat video that a fellow named Ronaldo Morales did recently, and he takes you on a tour of the woods near Wolf Creek during the winter when the snow is light, and you can actually see these huge rows of ancient garden beds that are 1,000, 2,000 years old or older right in the woods, and he gives you a terrific First Nation explanation of why they created them that way. So now that I've given you kind of a baseline that we had ancient, what Schoolcraft and Bella Hubbard named the ancient garden race of people, they say that they grew crops 2,000-3,000 years ago for centuries without any evidence of warfare on an industrial scale, meaning that they were producing so much food that it was being produced well beyond their needs, you see? So in piecing all this together, I've come to my own conclusion, which is they were the ancient grocery store and provided much of the supply logistics chain from all around the Great Lakes, including southern Michigan, portions of Indiana, Wisconsin, right up into western Michigan, the upper peninsula of Michigan. They were the grocery store for several thousand years, for many groups around them, and for another second culture as, or they are the second culture as Overstreet refers to them, and that is a group that most Americans have never heard of, but who are really quite amazing. And that is a group that we focus on a lot with the Ancient American Artifact Preservation Society, AAPS as we call it, and that is the ancient copper miners of North America. And this is a group that mined in excess of 2 billion, with a B, tons of copper for, it's an estimated, as far back by many researchers, as much as 8,000 years. And this copper, the big question in academics' minds is, where the heck did it all go? and it turns out that the vast majority of it went to the old world, to the Mediterranean area, where it jump-started what's known as the Bronze Age, circa about 750 BC. And consequently, in my research, I believe we're connecting the dots now that these people were the grocery store to the ancient copper miners who came, for instance, Phoenicians, Hittites, Carthaginians, who had their own massive sailing fleets, and they sailed here through the St. Lawrence River and down into the Great Lakes and up the Mississippi River, which 2,000 years ago was probably a mile wider and half as deeper than it is today. So very easy to navigate right on up to the Chicago River area, which was emptied from Lake Michigan across Illinois into the Mississippi, and so forth. So they could mine copper, ship it to places like Beaver Island in the middle of Lake Michigan, route it down to the Chicago inlet of the Chicago River over to the Mississippi, and down to a fascinating place called Poverty Point and other locations on the Gulf, where they would further prepare these 60-pound copper ingots called oxhides by academics because they resemble kind of the hide of a beaver when it's skinned. And they weighed about 60 pounds. And then what they would do is load them into their vessels and sail back to the Mediterranean and sell their goods, their product, which was worth considerably more than gold in those days. And we have tremendous evidence now that the copper getting into the Mediterranean around 750 to 1200 BC in effect helped cause revolutions on the islands of places like Malta and Crete and perhaps others, where the original power structure was thrown down because the people now had the means to make brand new types of weapons. And so that was the prime reason that copper and bronze were so highly sought after in that time frame of about 1200 to BC 2000 BC forward, because you had two choices then. If you were a young man, 16, 17, 18, you were either going to end up in some Egyptian or Hittite or Ottoman army kind of situation, or you could jump on a ship to a strange land, sail for a year or so, get there, mine for a couple years, sail back in a year or two, and come back and become a multimillionaire. And that's probably what happened to my outlook. So that's kind of a hose job in a nutshell of what we're dealing with.
Yeah, Lon, you've been talking about this industrial gardening for the native people in Michigan and Wisconsin, and they get the foreigners arriving on the ships. So do we have any idea of how many people are living in in this area, or is there like a formula to figure that out based on the size of the garden beds?
Well, great question. There's a couple elements. One is that most academics who have studied the ancient copper culture to the extent they can agree on a couple of aspects, while everything else is pretty much up to debate. They generally say that there were something on the order of 10,000 ancient copper miners per season on Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula. Now, most of the people listening to the broadcast probably have never heard of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and they've probably never heard of the Keweenaw Peninsula. But the Upper Peninsula of Michigan today only has about 200,000 people in it. Yet it would make a very sizable state in its own right. And Michigan is essentially two peninsulas if you look at it on a map. Lower Michigan is a peninsula, and then the Upper Peninsula, of course. If you look at the Upper Peninsula, there's a big finger that sticks out into Lake Superior across from what's known as Copper Harbor on the very tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula, and thus its name, Copper Harbor, is a large island called Isle Royal. So let me give you the ancient scale of that in terms of the copper miners, and then we'll talk about the population of the garden race in upper Wisconsin, for instance. So if you presume, as the academics generally agree upon, that there were probably roughly 10,000 copper miners in that region in the Keweenaw Peninsula anciently, they place 1,000 or more on the island of Isle Royal. Now, Isle Royal is just a long strip of land, and I can't recall the precise length of it. I would estimate it's probably 20 miles, 30 miles long. On that island are, I believe, something on the order of over 100,000 dug copper pits, ancient copper pits. And what the ancient miners frequently did is they would dig down about a maximum of 20 feet on average and bring this, what is the remnant of what's known as float copper, to the surface by the use of what are called hammer stones. And these hammer stones, they found thousands and thousands of them around the Keweenaw and Isle Royal and even further south. And they would arc out the copper, and then they would gradually lift it because it was so heavy using wood dunnage till they brought it to the surface, and then they would roll it over and then proceed to work it. Now, there's a pretty famous chap named Fred Ridholm who spent 40, 50 years examining these copper pits, and he really should have had an honorary PhD. He wrote a tremendous work on the ancient copper people, and I'll give you the actual title if I can find it, but it was Michigan Copper. And Fred, in his research, I think made a well-founded statement, and he said, and it's very fascinating to archaeologists, that they never have been able to find or locate any ancient dwellings or the remnant of dwellings, such as log post holes, for instance, that you would expect all these people to build housing for themselves so that they could house themselves during the seasons of mining and so forth. So Fred discerned that these folks, since they were a maritime society, that they lived on their ships. And so I surmise from that since, they would have faced winters of 100 to 300 inches of snow up there annually, they knew exactly when to get out of town. And so they would do their seasonal mining, take as much of their gross product. Their ships came in with ballast stones. If people can look up ballast stones, generally they were large round stones with a hole in them, and they would carry this ballast in the belly of the ships to create a proper water line as they sailed here. And then once they were ready to depart and take their product back to the Mediterranean, they would throw out their anchor stones and replace them with hundreds of these copper oxides in the belly of their ships, which would now serve as fresh ballast, you see. So with that in mind, now you have kind of a sense of the ancient copper culture or mining groups, and of course they were just solely engaged in this pursuit. Now let me explain one other thing that is fascinating. If you look at the pictures that are streaming, I sent in a picture of a group of the AAPS people standing behind a very large, what looks like to most people, because it's black and white here, like a big rock. That is not a rock. That is a 9-ton copper nugget. And it is referred to, okay, and that was discovered on somebody's farm back, I think, about 2005 or 6. A similar nugget of about, I think, 6 to 8 tons was recently also discovered directly across from Houghton, Michigan, which was an American mining center for America. In fact, the copper mines at Houghton, Michigan produced most of the copper in America from the 1880s to about 1940s in Houghton, Michigan. And directly across the river, there was a construction company digging basements about 5 or 6 years ago, and their claw on their excavator hit a nugget that was 6 or 8 tons, and they sold it to the Chinese for $25 million. Why? And to give you an increased appreciation for Michigan copper tends to be like that nugget. If you look at it on that card, that nugget is 93.7% pure copper. In other words, for instance, anciently, the Romans mined tin and copper in England and elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Most of the other copper in, for instance, Turkey and England and various other tiny sites where they could find it anciently, the copper that is around the rest of the world typically never exceeds 23% purity, which means that tremendous amount of human labor has to be expended to heat kilns to almost 1,100 degrees to burn rock so that you can smelt out the copper ore, right? So Michigan copper, this is called float copper, that giant nugget. And guess what? Anciently, they were everywhere in the Keweenaw Peninsula. So what I tell people is, and some of our academics and researchers, they all focus on these thousands of pits on Isle Royal. Well, Fred Ridholm says there's close to 1 million copper pits on the Keweenaw Peninsula. In fact, there are so many pits on Isle Royal that it is a national protected wilderness area with wolves and elk, and the elk population has suffered, and even wolves, for hundreds of years by stepping in these pits and breaking their legs. Okay, there are so many of them. And
Lon,
recently,
what is it in the soil or the atmosphere or the
in the geology of it?
Yeah, that puts such a great preponderance of copper in that area.
Excellent question. That is a tremendous geological question. Lake Superior anciently, and we're talking, I think, close to 900 million years ago, blew out volcanically and helped create the basins of Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and so forth. So whenever there's a volcanic blowout, depending on the type of material in the magma, as you can imagine, you get all kinds of geologic formations, crystals, diamonds, iron ore, every kind of mineral you can imagine flows out of it. And geologically, it's very interesting that the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale just happen to be gigantic veins of copper, and it just happens through the geologic processes that it turned out that it's like striking, like a miner wants to strike that big vein of gold, right? Well, this, you can think of that vein of gold or massive vein of copper as the entire Keweenaw Peninsula practically, and the entire area of Isle Royale, and in the very flat sands of Lake Superior in between Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula, they have been finding, using scuba divers now, smaller nuggets, that are several hundred pounds, 1,000 pounds, right off the shorelines of Eagle River and the Keweenaw Peninsula. So it just worked out that way geologically.
Now, are there mines still in operation up there?
You mean in terms of contemporary mining corporations?
Yeah.
Yes, there are a few. Most of they felt like in the 50s or 60s, most of the copper mining around Houghton, Michigan, Calumet forward had pretty much been played out. For instance, the Calumet mine there, I think across from Houghton, it goes down about 5,000 feet, as I recall, and I've been in that mine, just down about 2,000 feet. But about the 40s or 50s, Phillips Dodge in Arizona, which I can speak to, which was an area where I did my geological studies in college. Phelps Dodge mines created huge copper pit mines, open pit mines, as well as Butte, Montana, and Magna in Salt Lake area of Utah. So, in other words, they found huge mother loads elsewhere where they could do strip mining and haul it out in trucks, those massive trucks you see on TV, which was faster and more profitable and continue to this day. So, no, there isn't the level of mining at all that there used to be. There is a little bit, but when, for instance, the people that found this nugget on their farm, they wanted to sell the nugget so they could pay off the mortgage on their farm, and the AAPS group tried to do that for them, but ultimately the goal of AAPS was to save this nugget and put it in a museum, see, so people could appreciate and they could tell the story of the ancient copper mining cultures. But fortunately, some investors from China said, you know what, we'll buy it and we'll put it in our museum. So it's in a museum in China now.
Juan, speaking of, losing, this piece of copper, it's going to another country. There has been strip mining in the area.
Yeah.
What is the status of these garden beds now? Are they, fairly well protected?
Well, thank you for asking. The beds that are on the Menominee Nation, if you were to go on Google Earth, it's rather interesting. Under their treaty agreements, at one time, the Menominee Nation, according to Overstreet, held in excess of 10 million acres in Wisconsin. But under, the treaties of the 1800s, the vast majority of their lands were just sucked away by the government, and they are relegated to the current reservation area. But if you look on Google Earth, down on their reservation near Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Oconto area of Wisconsin, you will see a beautiful green forest, forested area that goes on for miles and miles, and then all the lands around it are basically, farmed lands. To your point, in the mid-1990s, there was a lady who discovered, and she was a doctorate from Northern Michigan University at Marquette, Michigan, and she discovered 3 miles of ancient raised garden beds along the edge of the Menominee River at Marinette, Wisconsin, which is the Wisconsin River that is the borderline from Michigan to Wisconsin. And the Menominee Nation claims the Wisconsin River as the birth river of the tribe, essentially, because they believe that the first Menominee were created and that the ancestral bear of the Menominee came out of the river and became human, and that eagle and bear and wolf and moose and crane, 5 other clans, came out of the river and were formed also, and they represent the primary clans of the Menominee people. So understanding that, what has transpired is there is a mining corporation. It's a Canadian mining group called the Back 40 Mine, and they have purchased and own, it's called the Aquila Resources Corporation out of Canada, and they've spent about 10 years and some $70 million strip mining the area. Sadly, this area on the Michigan side is full of ancient mounds, the remains of ancient Menominee villages. And sadly, their mining is going to produce tremendous amounts of acid drainage into the river. They're planning on leveling. They will eventually level 3 miles of ancient garden beds, which I refer to as geofacts, like artifacts, but they're earth made. So there's several groups. I think the Sierra Club, the Menominee tribe, there's a No Back 40 initiative. They're not really trying to stop the company from seeking exotic minerals in the northern part of their holdings, but they are trying to prevent them from destroying this tremendous historical site and these raised garden beds. And so far, the state of Michigan, amazingly, has issued permits for them to do metallic sulfide mining, and they're going after all kinds of exotic minerals and so forth. And they, so far, if you look down on Google Earth, they have a huge complex, and when they say strip mining, they mean strip mining. They go, they just, plow back the earth and everything's gone, and they sift out the soils and take the minerals. So that's the status of the Back 40 Mine project. There is, there's several websites if people want to look at them to find out more about what's going on. They can do so, but it is a grave concern to all of us. I don't have a problem myself with them mining, so long as it doesn't destroy, the mounds and so forth. I mean, can you imagine, for instance, a company being allowed to move into Newark, Ohio, and start strip mining the giant serpent mound, or Cahokia outside of St. Louis? It's unthinkable, and so
that's just losing too much history.
Right.
You just can't recover anything
gone
like
forever.
that. You can't. Yeah.
And we see that since the pioneers scraped off the land and plowed the southwest Michigan area, By the 1880s, it was gone. And there was nothing more to know other than what was recorded previously. But in terms of the Menominee Nation, and I know we're running out of time here, but I would like your audience to know that according to Dr. Overstreet and their research, there's several fascinating aspects about the raised garden beds that people need to know. One is that they have discovered literally thousands, hundreds anyway, but they're going to find thousands of ancient storage pits, subground storage pits. They range from about 4 feet deep. They're built of stone, and the ancient garden race would use them to store produce. Additionally, they found out that these gardens were extremely sophisticated. For instance, not only did they use the Three Sisters intercropping method, which is said to produce a better quality of product, they were masters at soil chemistry and soil dynamics. In fact, Overstreet said they only found out recently that they built many of their garden beds on bedrock, which they could not comprehend because nobody puts gardens on bedrocks because they thought bedrock, usually there's a gravel atop it, and you just have to pour tons and tons of soil on it. Well, apparently they did, and they would regularly replenish their soil with millions of basket loads of wetland muck, and probably like the Chinampas gardens of Mexico, probably used night soil, if you catch the drift, as a fertilizing agent. And they would regularly, annually, rebuild their beds with highly nutritious, restorative wetland mucks. Additionally, they created a type of pottery known as shell-tempered pottery, as opposed to the Mississippi and Caddoan form and woodland forms of pottery, which were made from stone, grinding granites down and mixing with clay and firing them. They would typically make their pottery what's called shell-tempered pottery. They would use calcium snail shells, mush it up, and create their pottery from this. And the archaeologists are amazed by this because chemists have told them that this was brilliant, because not only when they mixed their corn, maize, and squash and beans and peas in their pottery, they were mixing it and taking up the calcium in their foodstuffs as they created their food. They were pulling in what's called calcium uptake in their diet, making them very healthy, ancient American people. And so they were, and furthermore, they said the beds, they found broken pottery fragments in the beds, but they were placed there. They placed the pottery fragments vertically to help reinforce the root beds of the corn and beans. Additionally, through this, he said, we found out something else amazing about the social culture. Overstreet says they were unlike classical Native American cultures who built lodges and villages in close density and maybe palisades around them against invaders or intruders. Instead, he said their housing was much different, and it was very spread out and diverse. And to give you a sense, for instance, of the spoked wheels and the size of these garden beds, for instance, some of those beds where you see spokes, those were 6 to 20 feet wide as they radiated out from a huge center. Some of those other beds that you see, the long ones, are 14 feet wide and 20 inches or so high. So additionally, as they looked, and they've been studying the microscopic pollens and what we call phytoliths or starches found in the beds, and they have found things like, the beans, the squash, peas, and incidentally, these bean starches that they're finding in the beds predate all the supposed academic views that beans got here about the 1500s when the Spanish went into Central America and so forth. Guess what? There were beans being raised in these garden beds for thousands of years before the Spanish ever came to this continent. Where did they get those beans? Hey, they got them probably from the Phoenicians, Hittites, Carthaginians who sailed here. So what they also found was something else very fascinating called chenopodium. And to most people, but herbalists may recognize it because it has been an anti-parasitic used by First Nation people for centuries as an anti-parasitic against worms. And those chenopodium starches have been found up and down these garden beds. So sort of in closing, I would say, what I have come to believe now is, as I kind of said in the beginning, and I should preface that by saying, and I think Overstreet and Gardner have it right, the Menominee Nation people, who consist of about, their census arrives at about 9,000 to 10,000 people in the Menominee Nation reservation area proper, they, I believe, and I believe Overstreet underscores, and I get it from him, they have been on the landscape here for close to 10,000 years. Now, there's a couple of cool things about that I'll touch on in a second. I believe the Menominee people, and hopefully we can do some DNA studies, or somebody will in the near future, and look at their haplogroups, because I believe their haplogroup will trace itself back to the old world, the ancient world of Europe and the Mediterranean and probably North Africa, vis-a-vis many of the sailing groups.
Well, we got to have you on for 2-hour show. We're down to 30 seconds.
Oh, sorry.
Lon, and if people want to learn more from you and what Rick Osmond and Wayne May and all the other speakers are going to be discussing about America's ancient history, they can go to the AAPS conference in Harris, Michigan on October 5th through 7th at the Island Resort and Casino.
Right. And
they can go to AAPF.org website,
And they can make contacts there, and I would also turn them on to Wayne May. Look up Wayne May and Ancient American Magazine, and they will get their minds blown on ancient history and just how many cultures have come in and out of America for thousands of years.
Okay, guys, they're just going to cut us off. Thank you so much, and good night to both of you.
Thank you, Barbara. It's been great chatting with you and Mark. Have a great one.